Welcome to the Instant Speed Podcast. This is In Response. And what are we in responsing to? Well, FAB 2.0. Now, we did release yesterday or the day before our standard procedure, which is essentially the regular Wednesday episode. It was Majin Bay. That was recorded on Monday. We didn't even know that there was an announcement coming for FAB 2.0 or any of this massive announcement that was dropped on us. Schedules are what they are, and here we are now being able to react to it. So I have with me one of the most awesome people out of the community, and one with a very unique perspective as well, because Dave Rood here. Welcome back, Dave.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again.
No problem. You were on just like last week, so it's incredible to have you back. You loved it so much. But you have a unique perspective because you're both a competitive champion, a world quality or world-class player, but also you are very involved in the retailer aspect, being at Harry Tarantula in Toronto, and you manage the TCG elements of that store. So having you on to discuss and go through a little bit of what FAB 2.0 is, having your perspective, your insights are super valuable. So I do appreciate you coming through. So we'll start with just initial impressions, and then we're going to go through everything else. Now, obviously, we spoke about this. This was actually a pretty important, or rather prominent, point of conversation by a lot of people, which I thought was just a throwaway statement. Again, back in January when James White did the Instant Speed podcast, he made a passing remark about FAB 2.0, and I thought that a lot of people were kind of blowing it a little bit out of proportion. I thought it was a throwaway statement to say that there were going to be some things changing, so you say 2.0. It's just a different version. But some people took off with that to suspect massive overhaul. Is this the massive overhaul that we thought was going to come? What was your initial impression when there was a 2.0 actually announced?
Yeah, my initial reaction was this was a lot more than I personally expected. I thought this was only going to be a change to the first edition and unlimited, just the way they release boxes and things like that. But this was, a lot of points, a lot of things that I think they've been internally discussing for a long time, getting feedback from people, and they wanted to announce it all at once, because for the most part it's all very positive, but there's a couple things that people might have issues with, and if you announce it all together, then it makes it a lot easier to swallow everything.
Yeah, so the FAB 2.0 announcement came out on April 12th here on the East Coast of North America, and it was written by James White himself. So it's important when the head honcho actually gets his gets dirty on this stuff. Now, we're going to walk through some of the more key elements, and we'll talk about them. But the first one that is most important is retiring of first edition. And what I want to pull out of this paragraph, again, you guys can go to fabtcg.com and check out the article marked FAB 2.0 to get all the nitty-gritty about this. But the most important thing I pulled out of this was that James White is emphasizing, and does it many times, that the primary focus of Flesh and Blood is playing, not collecting. And I think that is important. And retiring first edition and the strategy behind that was to make sure that people had the cards when they were released so they can play the game. And he emphasizes play the game many, many times.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a huge part of their goal. And these changes show that. It's not just, saying words and not backing it up. This is a massive difference in how they distribute first edition and how it releases, how they're hoping that everybody who wants to buy a box when a new set comes out for a reasonable price can do so. And I think these changes do that. In the past with first edition stores, and it's gotten better as the set release. Like if you joined around the Monarch time, it was crazy. Like we only got a small amount of boxes, and the prices everywhere was out of control. And it's not, as far as LSS goes, that's not what they want. Like they don't make any more money if prices are inflated, and it creates a pretty bad feeling for players who end up spending a lot of money to get these boxes at release.
And as a retailer, I mean, we discussed this last week, where there's the requirements or the obligation to buy certain amounts of unlimited in order to get certain amounts of first edition. It kind of created this situation where everybody was hustling to get that first edition, and now the unlimited kind of rots on the shelf to a degree where you guys are waiting for opportunities to discount it or package deal it or do something. Now that there's just one one way to do it. Are you suspecting that this is just going to solve a lot of those scarcity issues early on?
Yeah, so for example, again, to go back to Monarch, they announced that it would come out like 3 weeks after the release of first edition. So for the most part, I think distributors already had these boxes in their warehouse. They just weren't allowed to release it until then. This would mean that they would have all the boxes at once, and I suspect that the allocations will be much larger. So if a store wants to get X amount of boxes, they will most likely get most of that, bearing printing issues and things that happen here and there. But for the most part, I think this will normalize the price of a box to like what we've seen that's close in North America, that's closer to map, and which I'm not sure for the US, but in Canada it's something around $105 plus tax, which is a very reasonable price for boxes, and it lets people buy as much boxes that they want to open, and it creates a very reasonable ecosystem, because then stores are not forced to buy boxes that they later might not be able to sell. It lets me, for example, like Let's Harry Tarantula, open a bunch of boxes for singles, because we have a lot of players who don't all some people will buy a couple boxes, but they want to fill out their decks with singles. Some other players only play Dorinthia, for example, and they're like, well, I don't want to buy a box for every set, I just want to grab the few cards that I like, that I want to upgrade my Dorinthia deck. So by having only one type of box and not being forced on all that, then it lets us open a bunch of boxes for singles, put it up for pre-order, and people can get it at release, which what's something that I've personally wanted to do for the store for a long time. We did it for a few sets for Unlimited, um, but it's not something we could do when first edition was heavily allocated.
Um, Apart from that, they've also announced the new set is going to be called Uprising. It's going to be releasing on June 24th. Hey, that's Saint Jean Baptiste.
That's true.
Are you guys gonna? I hope you guys gonna be open for that. Oh no, we're in Ontario here. I keep
Yeah,
forgetting.
we're not there yet.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. That doesn't exist. That's just for you, Quebec. But yeah, June 24th, there's going to be the release of the new set called Uprising, and that is going to be the first set that does away with the first edition Unlimited chasm between those. There's just Uprising. To quote James White, there is simply Uprising, and that is going to also come with a little bit more of a different drop rate for some of the cards. And this is another element. Again, when you're talking about trying to close the gap between players and collectors while maintaining the value and the appeal of collecting this game, you need to address things like cold foils. Cold foils obviously are way, way, way more attractive from a collecting standpoint than a standard rainbow foil. I have with me here a cold foil New Horizon that I bought from a friend, and if it came down to it, did I want, like, the price difference between the cold foil and the rainbow foil was close enough that I'm like, I'm gonna go for the beautiful one. I'm gonna go for the collector, the rarest piece, and I got that. But now people were thinking, if you're going to be removing the cold foil, rainbow foil, there's no first edition, second edition, how are you going to introduce cold foils, and how are they going to maintain the scarcity because there's no alternative? Well, the way they address that now is that the legendary drop rate is the same, but the drop rate of a cold foil legendary is now 3 times as scarce as a rainbow foil. So you're still getting the same opportunity to score a legendary card, but now these cold foil legendaries, I feel, are truly, truly chase cards. And even further than that, a fabled cold foil, I feel, is like the ultimate score. Yourself, how do you feel they tackle this element of maintaining the collectible appeal of the game, as well as the accessibility in this regard?
I think they did great. I'd have to look over the number exactly, but I believe he said in the announcement that legendary rainbow foils would be a little bit more common than they used to be.
One in 80 packs. Yeah, so 1 in
Yeah.
80 for the rainbow, 1 in 220 for the cold foil.
Yeah, so they decided to both make at the same time the cold foil more rare and harder to get for the legendaries, which will drive up the price a little bit and make it more exciting to open a cold foil, but although more rare. I believe it's still one cold foil per 24 pack, which would be one per box on average. But yeah, I think this adds legendaries to the ecosystem, but while also keeping the collective aspect of it very very interesting, and we'll see how the market react. I think if anything, this will drive down the price of people who are holding boxes sealed for long term. People who just buy boxes to put them in the basement and and hope that the game does well and sell it later, which I think is not exact. Like I think collecting is a thing that LSS is will emphasize and be like it's a part of our game and we understand it. We think it's a good thing that have people who collect. I think people would just buy out boxes from every store at set release, first edition, for example, and now whatever this new type of box is. It's not exactly something that should be encouraged. That's something that they want to push for one reason or another. One other thing that I wanted to say about Uprising coming out on June 24th and this new type of box, which is something I touched on when I was on your podcast before, is I think this also lets them hand out more pre-release if they want because the allocation's bigger,
Mm-hmm.
the game has grown. So I'm hoping that what was the one suggestion that I wanted them to do was be more liberal with how much they're giving out pre-release to smaller stores and things like that. So I think mid-June is going to be a really exciting time for Flesh and Blood.
They also talked about the cold foil reprint policy. Again, another protective element against for protectors, that cold foils are not going to be reprinted. If you want a cold foil of a particular card, you get the set that it was printed in. So Uprising cold foils will only appear in Uprising, not in the what we'll talk about next, which is the history packs, with the exception, of course, they said, of if there are certain promotional tournament related organized place like prizes, those might see reprints, but again, those then are marked with like a P for promotional, so they're distinguishable, and I think that that's pretty important as well. So overall, from all the collector aspects, there's this all culminates now to quote unquote reprints past, present, future, as James White is calling it, and the introduction of the history pack, which is like an anthology of the year that was. All the stuff that's come out, the first quote unquote history pack that's coming out, are going to feature Welcome to Wraith, Arcane Rising, and Crucible, which was essentially the first year of the game. The first three major sets, the first two draftables plus the supplemental, are being put together in what's called the history pack. And there's a very unique element to this, which some people look at and say, ew. Some people look at it and say, yeah. And some people have this weird kind of dichotomy of like, it's so ugly, it's beautiful. Myself, as a Star Wars player, playing with white border cards was not uncommon. Got tons of them. It was just the way it goes. White bordered Flesh and Blood cards and all the reprints like Fyendel Spring Tunic, Command and Conquer, Gorganian Tome. There's a lot of reprints coming, and they're all white border. Is this a good solution to, again, fleshing out people's collections, getting them access to the cards that they need while still protecting that pocket of collectors who want to maintain and sustain the value of their investments?
Yeah, I think it's a good way. People have very polarized reactions to white border cards. I know I've been around Magic a long time. There's a lot of white border cards from the early days of Magic. I personally don't really have a strong feeling either way. I've never been somebody that it bothered me if my cards didn't match, but I know it bothers some people. On that note, there's some people who have been using, for example, they'll have 3 Command and Conquerors in their deck. They'll have a first edition one, if you can afford it, a regular unlimited one, a first edition one, and then a foil one, and they do this for every card so that they can track when they're pitching. When they go to the second cycle. Some people don't want to count and keep track of when they get to second cycle, and this is a way to keep it. The white border card makes it more accessible. It's also a very obvious way when you draw a white border, Command and Conquer, you're like, okay, I'm on my second cycle. I can remember that. I think I have small issues with the history pack. It's not the white border thing that doesn't bother me. I think it's a good way to do reprint while also trying to keep value for the people who already have the foil version or the black border version. I'm not sure why they decided to go with 36 packs instead of the usual 24. I'm not sure if it's an announcement, but it was in the leak that was out there, and that might some people like to open boxes. Yeah, I think the price per pack will be roughly the same. If anything, it'll be probably a little bit better, but the price of a box is without a doubt going to be more expensive than the usual 24 boxes. And I'm not sure if the goal is to get reprints and cards in the hands of people. I'm not sure why they decided to move it to 36 packs. And and have the cost higher.
Y-
I personally like I've heard a lot of people say like, oh, like Welcome to Raid's out of print, Arcane Rising's out of print, all these unlimited sets are out of print, but they were still on the shelf of most stores. They were still in distributors. People wanted to have them, but I think this is something that's like maybe North American and Oceanic driven, that we don't really understand how, if they want to grow the game in, for example, in parts of Europe that didn't get that much unlimited, or if they later want to push South America, then if those sets are out of print, they don't really have a way to get those original cards in the hands of people. So we have to look at it from the perspective of they want to grow a game, and other people are not in the same situation as we are.
So the packs are going to be. So I think I see why there's 36. There's only 10 cards per pack versus the standard 15, and there's a lot less commons. And I think what people are trying to avoid is with reprints is they don't want to get inundated with sort of just draft chaff, right? Like they don't want to just get a whole bunch of extra stuff. I don't think this is meant to be a draftable kind of thing, given the fact that there's 8 heroes, right? So you can't really draft because it doesn't make sense. So I think what they're trying to do is they're saying like, all right, we know that you want to flesh out a collection of the important cards, the rares, the mythics, or whatever, or the majestics, or whatever. And we don't want to inundate you with a whole bunch of extra stuff that you don't need. So I think by adding more rares plus in a box, that's one way to do it. The price point on these though is the MSRP is 140 US, 180 Canadian, and $5 Canadian, 390 US per pack. So again, by sort of shaving out like 3 or 4 commons out of the pack, but adding more packs, you're getting more rares and you're getting more hits of the cards I'm sure that you're looking to actually flesh out, right? The cards that you're looking to hit. But I mean, from an aesthetic, I mean, white border cards never bothered me because I've played with white border cards all my life. Some people are like, I'm just white bordering everything. And for somebody who's not a collector like myself or not out there to bling out my deck, I'm much more inclined, honestly, that if I'm buying singles, I'm buying the cheapest single I could find. Like that's just me. But if possible, I'm like, if it comes down to it, like if I can trade up like my black border, a set of black border majestics for the white border equivalent plus cash, I'll do that all day long. Like to be, I'm not out here to put cards in a vault and whatever. I know some people are, but I honestly like it. And I think that this is a very good approach. And, aesthetic aside, like who cares? That's just me. They're also putting out, I think this is for the first time ever, the various languages of these cards. There's French, German, Italian, Spanish, and English. So English is already existing, but I think that's pretty sweet. I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of here in Canada and Montreal, whatever, seeing French cards. I've never seen French cards. I've played a lot of card games in Quebec, and I've never seen French cards being maybe not just not available. Like, what's your thoughts on the multiple languages thing here?
Well, stores in Quebec tend to carry like a small amount of French boxes. French cards were around when I played Magic. They tend to be not super popular, but I think this is more aimed at French or Belgium or areas that speak French, and same thing like in Spanish. I think it's more geared towards Europe than it is here for North America. I think in France, for example, it's pretty important to have French cards if you want to push the game. I know I was talking to somebody I know there, and he was saying it's pretty hard whether or not people want to play with French or English cards. That's their decision. But a lot of people are reluctant to play a game that's not catered to their language in general.
They're also looking through. So that's more of the collectability aspect. In terms of what we wanted to discuss, the FAB 2.0, that announcement also discussed the creation or the stabilization, cementing certain formats as legit. Whereas prior to this, they were kind of up in the air. Like, what was commoner? Was commoner just commons, or was it commons and rares and stuff like that? So they fleshed out a lot of the rule set for things like Ultimate Pit Fight, which, I mean, I've never played, but I've played Commander, and I've had a good time doing that, so that's fun. But Commoner, you as somebody who organizes tournaments at Harry Tarantula, do you feel like Commoner is going to be something that people are really going to dive into? Is it going to have a healthy player base? Same with Ultimate Pit Fight in that regard.
I think Commoner it's something that's interesting. I don't think we're gonna personally spread it unless I think LSS has to kind of be out front of that if they want it to be something that's successful. So I'm not saying they need to have like, a commoner, calling, but if they even start having like a Balharn or like events here and there, like even they could have a skirmish that's commoner instead of being blitz, just blitz. So I think they kind of have to be in front of it if they want this thing to take off. But if it's just a format they just want to kind of keep an eye on and let people enjoy, I think in general commoner is a great way to get people to the game. So that's a positive. As far as Ultimate Pit Fight, I think whether it's Ultimate Pit Fight or another format that comes out that's created by players, which is what Commander was for Magic, I think it's an important part of Flesh and Blood's growth eventually. I think I said it before. I think being, I'm hyper competitive in general, and I think having a casual impact to the game is something that's important for it to eventually grow if they want to keep the game healthy and things like that. Um, as far as looking at the rules and talking to some of my friends or some people that I know that have played Ultimate Fight Pit Fight, and again, these are just general guidelines. Like LSS even said, like make your own rules, but this is what we suggest. The only thing I find a little strange is the 40 card deck size. I feel like the bigger the deck, the more interesting it is. Like I would have suggested 60 cards personally. I think fatigue should probably not be, a part of what you're doing when you're playing a casual multiplayer game that tends to, maybe last longer or last more turns. People are not as aggressive playing multiplayer games as, they tend to be when they're playing 1v1. So that's the only thing that I found a little strange, but overall I think people will adjust and figure out, what works for them, and LSS might, change rules eventually.
They also talked about the a change to like the elo system and such, but also they hit on the banning and restricted list, which at the moment there was no cards that were restricted. And the way that James essentially describes it is that a restricted card is somewhere in between banned and not banned. It's legal or it's not legal. It's somewhere in the gray area between. That concept is no longer happening. What they've done is they've dropped that for what's called a suspended status for a card, which is fascinating. And they've given certain criteria of time frames, like it's either a card is suspended up until a particular date, or up until a particular banned or suspended announcement they mentioned, or until a particular hero becomes living legend. And they also say like there's nothing currently suspended, and it's something they're reluctant to do. But I feel like this is a particular situation where perhaps Seeds of Agony, for example, is a card that could have been suspended until Chain was, pushed aside. Like that to me is a card where it's like, all right, this is a suspended card until Chain is living legend, so to speak, because the card itself within other Shadow Heroes or with other Runeblades or whatever is not problematic, but within this framework of this hero, it's problematic. So they're kind of tooling around with that. How do you feel about their the concept of suspended cards up until particular dates?
Yeah, I think the suspended thing is a great thing. It's also a way to basically show players that maybe this card is super powerful, and we're trying what the format would look like if it was taken out, while also like if you say, for example, Duskblade is banned, the value of it is completely plummet, right? If it's banned in every format, it's only played in casual or in future format that have no ban list or something. But for the most part, the card is almost worthless. Even the cold foil are very cheap. If you say something is suspended, it kind of it might leave the door open to be like, well, at this time, this card's not, worth a lot of money. It's not coveted, but, keep an eye on it. Or even if it's something that was legal and people played with, and they were like, oh, now this is, I can't play with this card. It's like, no, maybe, keep it around in the future. It might be useful. Like, we're basically giving you a hint. I'm not a big fan of restricting cards in general. So I'm happy that they went away with that. I think it just adds more variance to the game. It's the same way that, if you lose to the one of legendary specialization from a hero, it's a little rough, but that's part of the game. But the more randomized things you add like that, where a card is super powerful, but you can only have one in your deck, then I think that in general that's problematic. It's also complicated as somebody who works in a store to try to explain to people in Blitz, this card is completely legal. You can play it in Classic Constructed. It's restricted to one, and then this other card is completely banned in every format. It just adds more and more things that you have to explain, or people sit down and they have an illegal deck list when they're playing a tournament in round. At some point when they get deck checked or something, it kind of leads to feel bads. The one thing that I do kind of want them to try out at some point is banning only one color of a pitch of a card, and this
Mm-hmm.
doesn't, stop that. This announcement doesn't stop that.
Next thing of note for FAB 2.0 is, like heroes, obviously, they're kind of digging into a little bit more of the lore of particular heroes and their quote unquote signature weapon. Obviously, weapons can be used by different heroes. We've seen in something like Rosetta Thorn, just every possible Runeblade is going to play Rosetta Thorn because it's head and shoulders above every other weapon that's out there. It's just that good. But now, should a hero attain living legend, they're taking their equipment with them, they're taking their toy with them. And the list was released of all the heroes and their signature weapons, so it's basically saying, okay, if this attains living legend, this is also retired. So that's fascinating to me, but at the same time, I don't know how I feel about this, because it's like, if you look, let's say, at Viserai right now is tied to Nebula Blade. But if Viserai somehow becomes living legend and it takes out Nebula Blade, like that's not the pairing that because it's not playing Nebula Blade, it's playing Rosetta Thorn, right? So it's fascinating in that regard. And something like Bravo Star of the Show has no signature weapon. You'd think it would be Winter's Wail, but it's not Winter's Wail, because Winter's Wail is tied to Oldham. So it's fascinating how the signature weapon system seems like a good idea, but at the same time, the lines are not necessarily directly drawn from the hero that's the problem and the weapon that's the problem, right? So I don't know if this, in my opinion, is a good idea.
Yeah, this is what, for the most part, I was overwhelmingly happy with the 2.0 announcement. This is one of the things that I'm not a big fan of. I think, for example, if you're banning Katsu and you ban Kodashis, some people have. I personally have two Kofo Kodashi. I'm attached to them. It's the first hero that I played, and I really enjoy it. That's not the end of the world, but I think what they're not considering well enough here is, yeah, Rosetta Thorn, I think we can all agree, isn't a really, really powerful card that maybe should have costed 2 to attack. Or maybe just ping for 1 arcane instead of 2. But the card is extremely powerful, and when it goes, I don't think anybody's going to really shed a tear for it. The problem that I see with these things, aside from the fact that, yeah, some of the heroes, like, for example, I think the Bolton one was, I can't remember what it was, but I think if somehow Bolton gets Living Legend, it's going to be because, I don't think it's going to be because it's Raiden. I think it's going to be, Sabers or things like that. So it's a little, the pairings are a little awkward, but also it kind of does one thing that I think a lot of people dislike, which is if I'm a casual player who plays a certain hero, and then because another hero who uses the same weapon gets Living Legend, my deck, which is not overpowered in any way, suddenly loses its weapon because this other deck was too good. And I think anytime there's bannings or issues that do what they call like sideways damage, I'm not sure how to say it really
Yeah.
well, but it's I think it's not a great thing for the game. Like I posted something that I saw somebody post in a Discord that I'm in that said, I've been playing Oldham ever since it came out. I'm very attached to this hero, and while Bravo was the best deck and dominated everything, I was still playing my pet Hold'em deck and trying my best to put up a fight. And if cards from Oldham end up being banned, like for people who are talking about Oak and Old changes or bans and things like that, if my deck becomes hurt because the number one deck is dominating too much, it's really a bad feeling for those people.
It's just fascinating that the weapon aspect, like, I get that they don't want to ban, like, banning is the worst thing that you could possibly do, and it's to a degree, it's sort of it's also an admission of guilt to the fact that, yeah, like, we messed up and we didn't anticipate this. But again, it's also something that's not, it's not a death sentence for a game when something gets banned. Every card game out there has banned or changed cards, and the fact that it's paper, I mean, what can you do? You can't go out there and scribble the new text on every single card in existence. It's not a digital client where you can just turn a dial and change something and everybody's client updates. It's not that kind of game. But at the same time, like, having a hero go down with his ship and the ship being like, like death dealer or something, or or like it's funny because yeah, like if Katsu takes out harmonized Kadachis, like what's Ira gonna play? What's Benji gonna play? Like what are these other heroes gonna play? It's odd in that regard. Like Rosetta Thorn right now is coupled to Briar, which makes sense. They were released together, they play together, but in reality, Briar's not the problem. Viserai might not be the problem. Rosetta Thorn itself is inherently a problem. So I'm with you here. I don't like that they coupled together weapons and heroes, especially since some of the coupling together is just okay. Well, we don't know where else to put this weapon, so we're going to slam it on this hero because it's legal to play with that hero. Like Chain and Galaxy Black. Chain doesn't play Galaxy Black. Like Chain plays Rosetta Thorn. It's just kind of how that goes. The other thing that they mentioned, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is they talked about something of a format in the making that's going to take some time to actually develop, which is like a living legend format, where basically it's a format only for heroes. I don't know if it's only for heroes or if everything's legal, but I think what they wanted to sell it as is once like multiple heroes in a few years become living legend, it's a format only for those heroes. And I think that in itself is kind of cool, but that's going to take a lot of time to flesh out. I think, but I believe that down the line, like if you're looking 5 years down the line, there's going to be some fascinating anticipations where, let's say the living legend format contains 4 heroes, and suddenly there's this new hero that's approaching living legend. People are going to be like, wow, when this hits living legend, imagine what that's going to do for this format. Like, so there's that kind of, it's kind of like a retirement home. It's like Del Boca Vista for these heroes, right? Where they're all going in there and having their own good time. But I want your opinion on that format itself, and perhaps down the line also kind of like a legacy format, like an eternal, a wild, as it were, depending on what card game you're otherwise familiar with, a format that includes everything and everything's legal, if that's something that they should also investigate.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting concept and one I didn't think about. So it's good that they're thinking ahead and trying to announce things. Yeah, I think if 4, 5, 8 heroes eventually are living legend, this could be an interesting format, especially as they keep releasing new cards. And it's a good way to let people use cards that are banned or not legal in competitive format anymore, and start people, if there's large events to it, then those cards will have some value. I think they might also be maybe not no ban, maybe because there's some cards that might still be too powerful and make the format not interesting. But I think they might be less inclined to ban cards in that specific format. So that gives a chance to do more broken and overpowered things. But if all the heroes are similarly powerful, then I think it can sort of balance itself in a way that's enjoyable.
After you digested this, I know that we were actually going through this as it was released. You, me, a bunch of other people like Tannen, Dalen Mack, a lot of other, Austin Yost, a lot of people. We were just kind of together as it was being released and discussing it. And now that we've had a good 12 hours, it's been a little like 12 to 16 hours to sort of digest and think about it, and we've seen reactions out there. I don't know how many live streams of reaction style things that were out there, but we've had a little time to digest. And I want your what's the most important part of this 2.0, and what did they miss? Like, what would you have liked to see, or where did they miss the mark?
Yeah, I think where they missed the mark are very small issues. I think overwhelmingly, like all the changes, as far as I'm concerned, are really good. And it's rare that you have an announcement of this size and people are, pretty much happy about almost everything. The very small nitpicks that I had were on the elo. I thought that was a big positive, that elo was only attainable from nationals, pro tours, and callings. Because the worst thing that you can, so this is tied to the fact that they would eventually start giving out pro tour invites or other things with elo. And I'm a big fan of elo in general. And I think the worst thing that you can do is have people sit out events locally because they don't want to lose qualifications due to elo.
Yeah.
So they added ProQuest and Road to Nationals as something that you can get elo. But the K value is really small. Like I think 8K value means that basically there's 8 points up for grab, which is almost never the case. Like if you are, for example, a 1700 player playing against a 1500 player, I think there's only maybe 5 or 6 point up at stake. So it would mean that if you go 3-1 or 4-1, you would basically break even. And I think that's small enough and reasonable enough that people will, I'm hoping, not avoid playing events, which is the worst feeling. Like if people are like, pillars of the community, or players that, like, for example, Isaac Root around locally, if Isaac is suddenly not playing our Pro Quest because he wants to maintain an invitation to an event, I think that's a bad thing for the community in general. So that's my minor thing, but hopefully it's the key value is low enough that people don't skip out on events.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
So.
sorry. I know. I just wanted to touch upon that real quick because I know that, again, the competitive scene is something that I'm new to. Not necessarily as like somebody who's in there lurking, but somebody who's just aware of it and in touch with it. And having a conversation and listening to Tan and Grace, who's talking about the fact that there were times where like he'd go like 7-1 at a tournament and lost and would lose elo. He'd lose ranking. When Tannen's on the case to go ahead and finish second at a tournament, you don't want to go there and think about it from a degree of like, okay, unless I'm perfect, I'm losing, and to the point where he would just avoid tournaments because even winning games, it depends on who your opponent is. It could be detrimental to your ranking, which is ridiculous. And that is a whole other kind of biscuit to bite into that I'm just learning about now. So having your opinion on that is important as well. So I appreciate that. And the most important part to pull out of this would be from 2.0.
The most important thought by far, I mean, for me as both a player and a retailer, is, having one box only, and one box that I believe will be much more widely available at release, and just getting cards in the hands of people, which is what James White has said repeatedly in this article, which is the most important thing. If people want the cards at release, they will have the opportunity to do so. And I think that's huge, that there's nothing else that you can ask, is to have like a reasonable price for the product that you're trying to sell, and your customers or players to not feel like they're getting gouged just so they can play the game at release.
Well, there you have it. So thank you so much again, Mr. David Rood, for just sharing some of your insights and your wisdom on this, because frankly, in terms of well-rounded opinions and been there, done that kind of mentality, you've been there and you've done that. So it's awesome to have you on the show. So thanks for doing this again, buddy.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And, I'm always available if you want to chat. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Deal. Yeah, and thanks everybody for listening again. What do you think about the FAB 2.0? Leave some comments here in the video. You can reach out to myself on Twitter and all that other awesome stuff. But more importantly, hey, go to harryt.com. Why not? Use the code FLAKE5, get 5% off your first order. And every time after that, if you like what you see, use the code FLAKE, support the podcast. Might as well throw some Harry T love in here as well. Great store, great people. There you go. All right, friends, thank you so much for listening to In Response. Don't forget, you're not losing if you're learning, so keep playing the game. You might win. We'll catch you next time on Instant Speed.